Prince Kael'tharos sat perfectly still at the center of the banquet table, hands folded as though carved from the same polished obsidian that adorned the hall. The vast chamber, built to echo with laughter and the hum of countless voices, held only the faint buzz of cooling vents. Dozens of crystal goblets glittered under golden lights, untouched, arranged with meticulous precision for guests who were never coming. Every second that passed scraped across his nerves, but his expression remained dutifully serene, sculpted by years of royal training. No one had taught him what to do when a celebration meant to unite an empire turned into an echoing display of abandonment. He glanced at the towering doors once more, as if willpower alone might conjure the nobles who had ignored his invitations. They had all crafted excuses wrapped in diplomatic courtesy, but the message beneath was clear. The empire no longer believed in him. The thought left a heaviness in his chest, a quiet ache he could not voice. He was heir to one of the most powerful dominions in the galaxy, yet he could not convince a single representative to attend a simple gathering.
His jaw tightened.
A future emperor should not tremble because a hall is empty, he reminded himself, though the reminder did nothing to steady the tremor inside. The lights dimmed a fraction as the flagship shifted into night cycle, a gentle change meant to relax guests now non-existent. The automated orchestra, scheduled to begin once the majority of attendees arrived, waited in programmed silence. Kael considered canceling the entire arrangement, but pride held him in place. Leaving would feel like acknowledging defeat, and the heir to the Thalorian dominion could not afford that image. Not with political tensions simmering in every system his family claimed to rule. For a long time he simply breathed, slow and shallow, trying to decide which humiliation wounded more, being stood up by the Empire or being witnessed enduring it. He imagined the guards outside whispering about him, how desperate he must look waiting for an audience that had already dismissed him. His throat tightened at the thought. He had prepared so much, negotiation points, cultural greetings, even the safe, restrained smile his advisors insisted projected warmth without vulnerability. Now all that preparation floated uselessly in his mind, like ceremonial banners ripped loose in an empty wind. His gaze traveled across the length of the table. Ornate dishes, crafted by some of the finest culinary artists in the Empire, released delicate aromas that mocked the stillness. He hated that part of him kept imagining footsteps. He hated even more that he kept hoping. A soft hiss cut through the silence. The massive doors slid open. Kael sat straighter, shoulders lifting with startled anticipation before he quickly forced them back down. He expected perhaps a nervous servant or a guard with another polite excuse from a distant colony. Instead, a tall human man entered, broad-shouldered, quiet, carrying himself with a disciplined calm that made no effort to draw attention but somehow did anyway. Commander Elias Ward. Kael had seen him only once during a brief diplomatic introduction. Humans were recent allies, still regarded with suspicion by many Thalorian factions, though their stubborn survival instincts and unorthodox strategies had earned reluctant respect. Elias walked with controlled economy, each step purposeful, his expression unreadable, but not unfriendly. Kael searched for some explanation. Perhaps the human had been assigned to check on him, but Elias offered no such excuse. He approached the long table, paused as if considering some unseen boundary, then sat beside the prince without asking permission or offering apology. The act was so unexpected Kael almost forgot to breathe. No alien noble would dare sit so closely without ceremony, yet Elias did so, with the quiet certainty of someone who believed presence itself was enough. For several seconds, neither spoke. Elias reached for a pitcher, poured himself a glass of iridescent drink, and took a slow sip. His lack of hesitation suggested familiarity, though Kael knew the human had never attended a Thalorian banquet. Elias placed the cup down with soft precision and looked straight ahead, giving no indication he pitied the prince or even considered the empty hall unusual. Kael's voice finally broke through the quiet. "You were not invited." Elias nodded, as if the statement merely confirmed something he already understood. "I know." The simplicity unsettled Kael more than any defiance could have. He expected some explanation, a formal apology, a diplomatic excuse. Instead, Elias' steady calm pressed against Kael's frayed composure, like a hand smoothing creased fabric. "Then why sit here?" Kael asked, unable to mask the edge in his tone. Elias didn't answer immediately. He seemed to weigh the question as though it mattered. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. "Because no one should have to sit alone at their own celebration." The words struck Kael with a painful accuracy. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't condescension. It was simply truth spoken without artifice. Kael swallowed, unsure how to respond. He had trained his entire life to navigate intricate political games, yet this straightforward human disarmed him more effectively than the most cunning noble. Kael surveyed the hall again, its emptiness now feeling slightly less suffocating. Elias' presence didn't fill the space, but it disrupted the loneliness enough to fracture its hold. For the first time since the evening began, Kael felt his lungs expand fully. "You understand," Kael said softly, "that your presence will be seen as an insult to those who refuse to attend." Elias shrugged with quiet indifference. People who refuse to show up rarely deserve to dictate the meaning of those who do. Kael almost laughed, a small, startled exhale. It was not amusement, but a kind of relief, like discovering a hidden crack in a wall long believed impenetrable. The silence that followed was different from before. Not empty. Not accusing. Simply still. Kael realized the central conflict of the night had shifted. The question was no longer why no one came, but what his response to their absence would define about him. The human beside him had changed the equation without making a single demand. The weight in Kael's chest eased, replaced by a low, simmering resolve he hadn't felt in years. He turned toward Elias, unsure whether to thank him or demand an explanation, but the human remained calm, patient, as though he had all the time in the world. Kael's next words formed slowly, guided by something fragile yet steady. "Then sit with me." Elias nodded once, subtle and firm, as though the invitation was the most natural request he had heard all evening. And for the first time that night, Kael did not feel alone. The questions still lingered, heavy and unresolved, but now they pressed forward rather than down. The Empire might have abandoned him, but one quiet human had chosen otherwise, and that singular act shifted the ground beneath everything Kael believed he understood. Something had begun. Kael studied the human beside him, with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Elias Ward's presence was calm, unassuming, yet there was an unmistakable steadiness to him, a quiet confidence that seemed to challenge the very emptiness of the hall. The prince had spent years surrounded by sycophants, advisors, and diplomats, all skilled in manipulation, each sentence measured to hide fear or ambition. Elias spoke nothing yet communicated far more than any courtier ever had. Kael realized that this silent human might be the first individual in the galaxy who saw him without obligation, without pretense. The room's golden light reflected off Elias' eyes, sharp, observing, entirely human. "Why did you really come?" Kael asked after a long pause, the words softer now, lacking the previous edge of irritation. He had expected some formal explanation, perhaps a diplomatic excuse, but the human merely inclined his head slightly. "Because no one else would," Elias replied evenly. "Because you shouldn't have to sit alone." Kael frowned. The simplicity of the statement unsettled him. Alien politics were never simple. Truth was always a matter of perspective, carefully wrapped in ceremonial layers of rhetoric. Yet, here was a human who spoke in absolutes, who ignored ceremony and straightened the world with plain words. The prince felt something unfamiliar, relief mingled with suspicion. Why would a stranger, a human, care so little for politics yet so much for presence? Elias leaned back slightly, arms resting casually on the table. "In my experience, people survive and thrive because they choose each other, not because titles demand it," he said, his voice calm, unshakable. "Empires crumble when individuals forget the value of loyalty and courage." Kael blinked, caught off guard by the observation. Loyalty. Courage. words that his advisors had taught him, but only as tools to manipulate. Now they felt like principles embodied by the silent figure beside him. The prince wondered if humans, with their stubbornness and simplicity, held a kind of power his own civilization had lost in centuries of protocol and hierarchy. Perhaps that was why the Thalorian Empire approached them with caution and curiosity in equal measure. The air in the banquet hall shifted subtly. Kael's practiced composure softened, and he spoke more freely than he had in months. He told Elias about the preparations for the evening, the rehearsed speeches, the anticipated laughter and camaraderie that had never materialized. I thought if I created the perfect gathering, people would be compelled to come. But they didn't. And now, I am left with my failure and these empty seats. Elias listened silently, a patient presence that neither judged nor interrupted. His silence held a weight far heavier than any words. Finally, he said, perfection often frightens people. They fear the standards it sets or the expectations it carries. You sought to impress them, Kael'tharos, not to connect. The difference is subtle, but crucial. Kael's gaze fell to the polished surface of the table. The human's insight cut deeper than any critique from his court. He realized that his entire life had been spent performing, adhering to rituals, masking vulnerability. Yet here was someone who understood, someone who could see the person beneath the title. Before Kael could respond, the distant echo of alarms shattered the quiet. The subtle hum of machinery gave way to a sharp, insistent klaxon. Red lights bathed the hall, casting jagged shadows across the crystal goblets and empty chairs. Kael's first instinct was disbelief, then fear, then the rapid clarity of action. The flagship was under attack. Elias did not hesitate. Without waiting for explanation or orders, he rose smoothly, positioning himself between Kael and the nearest exit. His movements were deliberate, precise, and instinctively protective. Kael realized that the human beside him was more than a diplomat. He was a soldier, a survivor, someone whose loyalty was expressed not through words but through action. Explosions vibrated through the hall as Kael's security detail scrambled to respond. Yet many of the guards were delayed, trapped by debris or hesitation. The prince felt a surge of panic. Centuries of ceremonial life had never prepared him for sudden violence. But Elias remained calm, his presence anchoring Kael amid the chaos. "Stay close," Elias instructed softly, voice low but commanding. "Follow my lead." Together they moved through the hall, weaving past overturned tables and splintered decorations. Kael's mind raced, trying to reconcile the absurdity of his situation, alone at a celebration, yet now reliant on a human stranger to navigate a deadly threat. Every instinct screamed that this was impossible, that the night's failures had been meaningless, and yet, here was someone proving the opposite. As they reached the corridor leading toward the command decks, Kael caught glimpses of the attackers, masked figures, moving with precise coordination, intent on sabotaging the ship's critical systems. He realized the danger was not random. This was an organized faction, one that wanted him dead. The Empire's politics had escalated into violence, and the empty banquet hall was merely a prelude to the assault on his life. Elias assessed the route with practiced efficiency, guiding Kael past security nodes, through emergency passageways, and around hazards that could have ensnared the unprepared. Kael's heart pounded with fear, but his trust in the human beside him grew with every calculated movement. He could sense, almost instinctively, that survival depended not on the protocols he had learned but on adapting to the moment, something humans seemed to excel at naturally. Through narrow corridors and twisting stairways, Kael began to see the human not as a stranger, but as an ally, someone whose presence challenged his assumptions about strength, loyalty, and leadership. For all his training and privilege, Kael had never truly been tested. Not in survival, not in crisis, not in trust. And now, in the quiet moments between alarms and gunfire, he understood that Elias represented a different kind of power, one forged not from status or ceremony, but from choice and courage. Finally, they reached a junction where the corridor split toward the engine cores and command deck. Kael paused, breath heavy, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down. The ship, the Empire, even his own life hung in the balance. Elias stood beside him, steady and unyielding, as though his confidence alone could guide the prince through the storm. Kael swallowed hard. This is only the beginning, isn't it? He asked, voice taut with tension and awe. Elias' eyes met his, unflinching. Yes. But beginnings are where legacies are made. For the first time, Kael did not feel abandoned. The Empire might still doubt him, the nobles might still snub him, but here, beside a human who had chosen to act, the prince found a measure of clarity. The banquet's emptiness no longer defined him. The knight's trials had only begun, and survival, and perhaps the reclamation of his place, depended on the choices he would make next. He realized that trust, courage, and loyalty were not abstract concepts, but tools to navigate the chaos ahead. And for the first time, Kael felt ready to wield them. Explosions reverberated through the hull of the Zephyrion, a harsh percussion that rattled chandeliers and sent shards of crystal glittering across the floor. Kael'tharos stumbled, arms instinctively reaching for support, but Elias Ward was already in motion, placing himself between the prince and the nearest breach. The human's movements were fluid, precise, unhesitating, a stark contrast to the panic surging through Kael's veins. Every second counted. Hesitation here could be fatal. The silence of the banquet hall had been replaced by the sharp, chaotic symphony of war, yet Elias remained a tether, steady and unflinching. Kael followed closely as they navigated a corridor now partially collapsed from the first wave of explosions. Sparks arced from exposed conduits, and smoke curled along the walls, stinging his nostrils. The prince's mind raced, processing threats that went beyond political maneuvering. This was immediate, corporeal danger, and he was utterly unprepared. He realized in that instant how ill-equipped he was for survival outside ceremony, yet Elias moved with deliberate calm, scanning each corner, each doorway, each shadow for threats. Kael had expected a human to be impulsive, but this one was surgical, efficient, lethal if necessary. A squad of masked attackers appeared at the corridor's far end, weapons raised and precision-trained. Kael froze, instinctively stepping back, but Elias reacted without hesitation. With a swift, fluid motion, he struck the nearest assailant, leveraging the man's momentum against him. Bones cracked under expertly applied force, and Kael felt a jolt of fear and awe. This was no diplomat. This was a soldier who embodied both human adaptability and discipline, a combination the prince had never encountered. Kael's mind struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet human at the banquet table with the figure before him, calculating, formidable, unyielding. "Stay behind me," Elias commanded, voice low but authoritative. There was no room for hesitation. Compliance was a matter of life and death. Kael obeyed, relying on instinct and observation, trying to emulate movements he barely understood. Each step became a lesson in timing, positioning, and awareness, the human beside him a living blueprint for survival. As they moved deeper into the ship, past corridors twisted by the force of the attack, Kael glimpsed what was at stake. Saboteurs had infiltrated the engineering bay, targeting the ship's fusion cores. A catastrophic detonation could annihilate not only the flagship, but the surrounding fleets. The prince's stomach tightened at the enormity of the threat. This was not a mere political conflict, it was a battle for survival, for the empire itself. And he, for all his title and training, had been inadequately prepared. Elias glanced at him, assessing, anticipating Kael's hesitation. "You need to focus," he said. "Fear will paralyze you. Observation and decisive action will save you. Trust your instincts, Kael'tharos." There was no arrogance in the tone, only clarity. The prince realized that Elias' calm was not born of fearlessness, but of experience, and that trust in him might be the only thing separating life from death in these next crucial moments. Through a maze of debris-littered passageways, they approached the engineering chamber. Smoke and heat rolled through the corridors, the alarm systems shrieking with red urgency. Kael's hands shook, but Elias guided him, steadying his balance, correcting his posture, subtly teaching him the rhythm of survival without overt explanation. Each encounter with the saboteur was brief, efficient. Elias neutralized threats with controlled strikes, while Kael, following instinct and observation, assisted in minor ways, slowly building confidence in his own ability to act under pressure. At last, they reached the edge of the engineering bay, the epicenter of the attacker's objective. Kael's eyes widened as he saw the sabotage devices attached to the fusion conduits. The explosive payloads glimmered ominously, a deadly puzzle designed for speed and efficiency. "We need to stop them," Kael said, voice tight with urgency and rising determination. He no longer felt entirely paralyzed by fear. The human beside him had transformed the terror into focus. Elias nodded, already analyzing the devices. "We can disarm some manually. Others must be neutralized remotely. I'll cover you while you handle the accessible triggers. Move quickly, deliberately." He gestured for Kael to approach a console embedded in the wall, its alien interface glowing faintly under the heat and smoke. Kael's fingers hovered uncertainly, but Elias' presence provided a strange reassurance. Mistakes would cost time, but not necessarily life, as long as he trusted his guide. The sabotage squad reappeared, weapons raised, but Elias intercepted them with seamless efficiency. Kael moved with newfound awareness, following instructions, stabilizing the area. Each action was a lesson, each breath measured. The prince felt something stirring within him, a combination of fear, determination, and the dawning realization that leadership could be forged not only in ceremony but in crisis. His role had transformed from a passive figurehead to an active participant, a student of survival under the tutelage of the human beside him. Finally, the last device was neutralized. Smoke still curled from damaged conduits, and the alarms blared, but the immediate threat was contained. Kael turned toward Elias, chest heaving, sweat mingling with the dust on his brow. You saved me," he said, awe and gratitude mingling in his voice. "And the ship." Elias shook his head, expression calm but serious. "We saved each other, in a way. You learned to act. I protected because it was necessary. The Empire relies on choices made in moments like these. Survival depends not on rank, but on action." He gestured toward the corridors that led back toward the command deck. "There's more to be done. The attackers are organized. Their objective is bigger than this chamber. We must move." Kael's gaze swept the wreckage, the faint glow of damaged panels, and the injured crew members beginning to emerge from cover. He felt a surge of resolve, no longer entirely passive or defeated. The banquet hall, empty and mocking earlier, seemed a distant memory. Tonight, the lesson was clear. Survival, leadership, and loyalty were tested in action, not ceremony. As they moved again, side by side through the ship's twisted corridors, Kael understood the magnitude of what he had witnessed. Elias was not just a guide or protector. He was an exemplar of human resilience, ingenuity, and loyalty. Each step reinforced the lesson that had begun at the empty banquet table. Power alone did not define one's worth, nor did titles guarantee survival. Choice, courage, and unwavering presence did. They rounded a corner, and the corridor opened onto a junction leading toward the command deck and the upper hull. Kael's chest heaved with exhaustion, but his mind was sharpened, his instincts awakened. The immediate threat of the engineering sabotage had been neutralized, but the conflict was far from over. Through Elias' guidance, Kael had begun to see his own potential, not as a figurehead, but as a leader capable of action under pressure. He turned to the human beside him, meeting his steady gaze. "I understand now," Kael said, voice low, filled with a mixture of awe and resolve. This is what leadership requires. Not ceremony, not empty words, but presence, loyalty, and action." Elias' expression remained calm, but the faintest hint. The aftermath of the attack left the Zephyrion scarred but intact. Smoke still drifted through the upper decks, and emergency crews scuttled among the damage, repairing conduits, attending to injured personnel, and restoring order. Kael'tharos stood on the command deck, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. The emptiness that had once haunted him at the banquet hall was gone, replaced by a clarity forged in the crucible of crisis. He surveyed the surviving officers and crew, his voice firm and deliberate. Report. Information flowed swiftly. The saboteurs had been neutralized, key systems restored, and the fleet surrounding the flagship remained secure. Kael listened carefully, noting each detail, each subtle implication. In the past, he might have deferred to subordinates, trusting only in hierarchy and title to guide action. Now, he engaged actively, weighing each report, questioning assumptions, and making decisions that affected the lives of thousands. The prince had transformed. His authority no longer relied solely on birthright but on discernment, courage, and the capacity to act decisively under pressure. Elias Ward remained at his side, quiet but ever vigilant, his presence a constant reminder of the night's lessons. Kael glanced at him, a measure of gratitude flickering in his gaze. "You've done more than any diplomat should," he said, voice steady, though his words carried weight beyond mere courtesy. "Without your intervention, the outcome might have been catastrophic." Elias shook his head slightly. "I did what was necessary. You've learned to act in the moment, Kael'tharos. That will matter far more to the Empire than any banquet ever could." The simplicity of the statement struck Kael again. The human had a way of condensing truth into words that cut through complexity without diminishing it. Word of the prince's direct involvement in saving the flagship spread quickly. Messages were transmitted to colonies and allied systems alike. Where once Kael had been seen as an isolated, ceremonial figure, he was now recognized as a leader capable of decisive action, able to stand under pressure and guide others through chaos. Reactions varied. Some factions that had ignored his invitations now reconsidered, intrigued and respectful. Others remained skeptical, clinging to tradition, but the shift was undeniable. Kael felt a cautious optimism he had never known. Later, in the quiet of the medbay, Elias sat on a narrow cot, one arm bandaged, his uniform scorched in places. Kael approached, moving carefully, aware of the human's injuries. He lowered himself onto a nearby bench, watching the steady rise and fall of Elias' chest. "You could have refused," Kael said quietly. "You weren't obligated to protect me or intervene." Elias' dark eyes met Kael's, calm and unwavering. "Obligation has little to do with it," he said. "I acted because someone needed to." "Because you needed to." "And because actions define the future more than titles or protocol ever will." Kael absorbed the words, feeling their weight settle over him. For years, he had assumed authority was inherent, that power flowed naturally from his bloodline. Now he understood that leadership required choice, courage, and loyalty, values embodied by this human who had entered his life silently, without ceremony, and transformed it with presence and action. The prince's hands hovered briefly, uncertain, before resting on the edge of the cot. "I underestimated humans," he admitted. "I thought our differences would always separate us, that your species' methods were incompatible with Thalorian discipline and order. But tonight, you've proven otherwise." Elias offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Humans adapt. We survive because we choose our allies carefully, because we act when others hesitate. You have that potential too, Kael'tharos. The Empire's strength depends not on your isolation, but on your willingness to embrace it." Kael considered the statement, eyes tracing the curve of the medbay ceiling as alarms softened and the flicker of emergency lights stabilized. He realized that the true conflict of the night had never been the attackers or the sabotage. It had been the isolation, the absence of genuine support, the untested nature of his leadership. That challenge had been met, not through ceremony or diplomacy, but through presence, action, and trust. Days later, the Zephyrion hosted a new gathering. This time, the hall was vibrant with delegates from various colonies, military commanders, and advisors who had once dismissed Kael'tharos as ceremonial and inconsequential. Crystal goblets clinked, laughter echoed against the polished obsidian, and discussions filled the air with energy and purpose. Kael observed the crowd with a new perspective, aware of the difference between appearances and substance. Elias sat beside him, silent, unassuming, as he had that first night, yet his presence carried a gravity all its own. Kael felt the weight of gratitude and respect, knowing that this bond, formed in quiet observation and crisis, was stronger than any political alliance in the room. "You've changed everything," Kael said softly, almost to himself, yet Elias heard. "I only helped you see what was already possible," Elias replied. His tone was calm, but the truth resonated. Kael had grown not because of his lineage, not because of empty protocol, but because he had been challenged, guided, and trusted. The prince turned his attention to the hall once more. Delegates approached him with a mix of curiosity and respect, acknowledging his decisive role in preserving the flagship and the fleet. The Empire had begun to recognize a different Kael'tharos, one who led with clarity, courage, and empathy. And for the first time, he understood that true leadership was measured not by ceremony, but by the choices made in moments of crisis. Kael glanced at Elias again, a faint smile forming on his lips. "Sit with me," he said, echoing the invitation that had begun their story. Elias inclined his head, settling beside him with the same quiet composure. The hall was full, yet Kael felt the same comfort as that lonely, abandoned evening. Presence, trust, and action. Those were the principles he would carry forward, not only as a prince, but as a leader capable of earning loyalty and forging alliances that mattered. As the celebration continued, Kael realized the Empire's future rested not on empty ceremonies or hollow displays, but on the strength of individuals who chose to act when it mattered most. The night's chaos had revealed the path forward, a leader who embraced courage, forged connections through trust, and relied not on inherited power but on the loyalty and judgment of those around him. The prince allowed himself a long, steady breath, feeling a rare sense of peace. The emptiness of the banquet hall was now a memory, replaced by a living, vibrant empire that had begun to see him not as a figurehead, but as a leader capable of action and empathy. And beside him, silently, patiently, Elias remained, proof that one human, one choice, could redefine the course of a prince, a ship, and perhaps an entire empire. Kael'tharos leaned back, surveying the hall, the delegates, and the glowing panels above. The night had begun in silence and abandonment, yet it ended with presence, trust, and the promise of a future defined by courage. For the first time, he felt fully ready to face the Empire, and whatever challenges awaited, with someone by his side who would not falter and a newfound understanding of the strength within himself.